Hello, my name is Dave Milinkov, and today I will be giving you an insight to what medieval Japan was like. The first thing that I will be discussing is women in shogunate Japan. Women in shogunate Japan were not written about very often, so there is not a lot of information on them. But we do have a book called the Pillow Book, which did give a good insight onto what being a woman was like in feudal Japanese times. Some Japanese women farmed, while others waited for a man and spent their time writing poetry, playing music on instruments or singing, or conversed with other like-minded women. Some women fished for shellfish by tying thin ropes to their waists and diving out of boats, while others begged for money. These beggars were generally wandering Buddhist nuns. During feudal Japanese times, women were generally servants for a person of high stature, like an emperor or a noblewoman. These servants acted as a food preparer, a hairdresser, or they nursed the children. For high-end noblewomen, they had very specific standards of beauty. To these noblewomen, being beautiful meant being plump, having small red lips, being very pale, and having very long hair. They used rice powder to pale their appearance and shaved their eyebrows, drawing new ones higher up towards their forehead, using black ash. These noblewomen also wore very expensive and complex colored silk gowns, skirted trousers, and brocade jackets. Women in feudal Japan generally only lived until their late 20s due to different forms of tuberculosis and also to beriberi, a disease that was caused by a vitamin B deficiency. Because of how short their lives usually lasted, marriages were generally arranged when the woman was young, and their husbands generally had several wives to keep their lineage going. Noblewomen spent copious amounts of hours perfecting their handwriting and writing down famous poems. High-quality handwriting was a sign of high class and made a woman valuable, as many men and many women were illiterate. Next, I will be discussing military might and the importance of the military. In shogunate Japan, the shogun and his militants played an extremely important role in most shogunate periods, having more power and more control than the emperor himself. For about 200 years, from the years 1400 to 1600, there was no longer an aristocratic rule. Instead, the military ruled over all of Japan, and the emperor only had ceremonial duties. This was called the Warring States period. Being a warrior in Japan was much more than just a job. It was a way of life. These samurai warriors protected Japan to the death, following the code of the Bushido, a value system for discipline and honor, among other things. The Bushido required the warriors, known as Bushi, to serve their lord honorably, even if that meant death. If the Bushi displayed any form of disgrace, they were required to kill themselves with a short blade. Military might was extremely important in feudal Japan, as they kept citizens, daimyo, and even during certain periods, the emperor in line. The shoguns during the Warring States helped to develop Japan as they created a government called the Bakufu, which is a tent government. The Bakufu began during the Kamakura period. During the 12th century, political power started to drift away from the emperor and towards the shogun. This meant that the shogun acquired power over all of Japan. Now, to Japanese art. Art in Japan has been around since 9000 BC, and the term art covers a wide variety of it. Art in Japan varies from literature, paintings, sculptures, architecture, and other various handcrafted or written items. Art and culture in Japan was not influenced by other countries, as they were very isolated and had barely any contact with the outside world. This meant that Japan had a very unique art style like no other, as they developed their art alone. The earliest display of complex art in Japan was produced in the 7th century, and seems to have connections to Buddhism, which somehow reached Japan in the 6th century. The term Japanese art covers lots of art styles, like pottery, sculptures, ink painting, calligraphy, woodblock prints, origami, paintings, literature, and architecture. Japanese paintings were very different compared to medieval paintings in Europe, as these paintings are much more detailed, but they are still 2D. Art during the Edo period did not come from leaders or high-class artists, but from two of the lower classes in the hierarchy system, the merchants and the artisans. The preferred art style in Japan was painting, practiced by amateurs and professionals alike. Painting in Japan displayed artistic skill, as these paintings were really detailed. Up until modern times, writing was practiced with a fine brush and not a pen or pencil, which allowed them to use silk to write on instead of paper, which made this writing extremely valuable. Japanese ceramics are now considered the finest ceramics in the world because of their complex and detailed design. As my last topic, I will be talking about the samurai. In shogunate Japan, being a samurai was an extremely important role. It meant defending their country, their lord, and their emperor. Being a samurai was much more than a job to them. It was considered a way of life. Samurais, when in battle, were required to be honorable. This meant that they were not allowed to display fear, cowardice, and could not admit defeat, and could not surrender to the enemy, or they would be required to commit seppuku. Seppuku was a disembowelment technique in which you would commit suicide by plunging a short blade called a tanto into your stomach and draw it from left to right, cutting it open your stomach. This is all part of the Bushido, which means way of the warrior. All samurai were required to follow this code, which also includes loyalty, martial arts mastery, frugality, and honor unto death. Samurai armor developed and changed immensely during feudal Japanese times. Armor in Japan has a very long history, going back to the 4th century. Japanese armor is thought to have been developed from the armor used in ancient China and ancient Korea. Tanko and kaiko were types of armor that were used before samurai designs. The tanko and kaiko were constructed from several iron plates that were connected by leather strips. When the Japanese started to trade with Europeans, the samurai acquired the European armor and then began to modify and combine their own types of armor with it, which allowed them to develop armor that was effective against matchlock muskets. Samurai were not always male, as there were several female warriors that were known for their heroic deeds. Females that were samurai were not always warriors, though, as female samurai generally stayed at home, acting as a housemaid, cleaning and keeping the house tidy until the husband returned from battle. Samurai warriors were trained and prepared to fight their whole life to become a samurai. At the age of 3, they practiced basic fighting techniques and skills with wooden swords, and were then given a real weapon between the ages of 5 to 7. At this age, they were generally sent to be raised by relatives or a fencing instructor, where they were taught to fence, taught military tactics, how to use a bow and to be an archer, how to ride a horse, how to use a spear, and taught unarmed combat such as jiu-jitsu. As you can see, Japan had a wide variety of things during feudal times. I hope this presentation gave you a good insight to what medieval Japan was like.